The road stretched out in front of her like a ribbon of darkness, the kind that swallows sound and swallows light. Diane Williams gripped the steering wheel with tired hands, her knuckles pale under the glow of the dashboard. The old Honda Civic coughed now and then, the way it always did when it was running on more prayer than gas. In the back seat, her daughters, Keisha, 12, and Amara, 9, were tangled in blankets, their soft breathing a small comfort in the stillness of the night. It was almost midnight, and the Alabama back road was empty. Too empty. The kind of empty that makes you feel like the world has forgotten you exist. Diane had just finished her third job of the day, cleaning offices until her feet ached so badly she could barely press the gas pedal. She longed for the safety of home, for the warm creak of their old apartment's door, for the moment she could finally drop onto her bed and not move until morning. Her headlights cut through the dark, revealing nothing but asphalt and shadow until suddenly something caught her eye. A flash of twisted metal glinted ahead. She squinted, leaning forward. Her breath hitched. There, just off the shoulder, was a black BMW, its front end crumpled like paper, the glass shattered across the asphalt. And lying next to it, sprawled in the dirt, was a man. Her foot hesitated over the brake. Every warning her mother had ever given her screamed in her mind, "Don't stop for strangers at night. Don't get out of the car on an empty road." She was a black woman alone, except for the two girls sleeping behind her. This could be dangerous. No, it was dangerous. The Civic rattled as she slowed, the engine protesting. She glanced in the rearview mirror at her daughters. Keisha stirred, rubbing her eyes. "Mom," she murmured, "why are we slowing down?" Diane's voice was calm, even though her pulse was not. "Someone's hurt, honey. Why? Stay in the car." Her conscience roared louder than her fear. She had lived enough life to know that you don't just drive past another human being lying broken on the side of the road. Whatever this was, whatever trouble it might bring, she couldn't pretend she hadn't seen him. She eased the car onto the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath the tires, and put it in park. The night air that rushed in as she opened the door was cold and sharp, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood. The man was dressed in what had once been an immaculate suit, now torn and smeared with dirt. His expensive Italian shoes looked wildly out of place against the dusty roadside. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, catching the light from her phone as she knelt beside him. He groaned, shifting slightly. Even in his vulnerable state, there was something about him, a tension in his jaw, the way his hand twitched as if reaching for control, that told her this was a man used to being in charge. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, her hand trembling as she touched his shoulder. His eyelids fluttered and then his eyes opened, locking onto hers. For a brief moment, there was confusion, vulnerability. But it vanished almost instantly, replaced by something sharper, calculating. Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, but his tone carried an edge. "On Route 17, about 20 minutes outside Birmingham," she replied, steady. "Your car rolled. You need medical attention." He tried to sit up, wincing. "I'm fine," he muttered, but his legs betrayed him, buckling under his weight. Diane glanced toward her daughters, watching from the car, their faces pressed to the glass. The air between her and the stranger was heavy with unspoken questions. Who was he? What happened? And why, even bleeding and broken, did he look at her like he was assessing a problem to solve? Her instincts told her this man was trouble, but her heart told her he was still a human being in need, and Diane Williams had never been the kind to walk away. She took a breath, slid her arm under his, and began to lift him toward the car, having no idea that this single act of kindness would alter the course of both their lives forever. The door of the Honda creaked open, and the faint smell of old upholstery mixed with the metallic tang of blood as Diane helped him into the back seat. His weight sagged against her, heavier than she expected, his breath uneven. The soft, startled gasps from her daughters filled the space. "Mom?" Keisha's voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes wide as she scooted closer to her little sister. "It's okay," Diane assured them, though her voice carried a tension she couldn't hide. "Buckle up. We're just getting him to the hospital." The man leaned back, his head resting against the torn headrest, his expensive jacket crumpled under him like it had never known dirt before tonight. He said nothing, just stared out the window at the streaks of passing shadows. The Civic's engine grumbled as Diane pulled back onto the road. The silence inside was almost louder than the tires on asphalt. Every few seconds, Diane glanced at him through the rearview mirror. He wasn't just injured, he looked unsettled. His jaw tightened when their eyes met, as though he was trying to make sense of her being there at all. "What's your name?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. There was a pause, as though he was debating whether she deserved the answer. "Richard Davidson," he said in a way that suggested the name should carry weight. It meant nothing to her. "I'm Diane Williams," she replied. "These are my daughters, Keisha and Amara." His gaze shifted briefly to the girls, but there was no warmth in it, only curiosity. "You shouldn't have stopped," he muttered, almost to himself. "And just drive past?" Diane kept her tone calm, but there was steel under it. "That's not how I was raised." He leaned his head back again, closing his eyes, his breathing slowing as if exhaustion was pulling him under. But even as he drifted toward unconsciousness, his voice came again, faint. "Not man." People would have stopped. The hospital lights were still miles away, but their glow on the horizon was a comfort. Diane's hands stayed tight on the wheel, her mind split between the road and the stranger in her back seat. She didn't know why, but she had the distinct feeling that this man wasn't used to being in the position he was in now. Dependent, silent, and at someone else's mercy. The Civic coughed as they climbed a hill, the sound echoing in the stillness. Richard opened his eyes again, studying her in the mirror with a look that was hard to read. Part assessment, part something else. Diane focused on the road ahead, not breaking eye contact for more than a moment. She had no idea who he really was or what story had landed him on that dark stretch of road. But something in her gut told her that this meeting, accidental as it seemed, was not the end of the night's story. And she couldn't shake the unsettling thought that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't an accident at all. The hospital sat like a beacon at the edge of the city, its floodlights casting pale halos into the night sky. Diane's headlights joined the circle of light as she pulled into the emergency drop-off. The moment she stopped, the Civic gave one last shaky sputter, as if it too was exhausted from the night's events. She stepped out into the chill air, moving quickly to open the back door. Richard stirred, his face pale under the streaks of blood and dirt. When she offered her arm, he hesitated, not because he didn't need the help, but because the idea of needing her seemed to scrape against something inside him. "Come on," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You're not walking in there on your own." Inside, the hospital lobby exploded into motion the second they crossed the threshold. A nurse's eyes widened when she saw him, and within moments, a team of medical staff surrounded them. Richard was whisked into a wheelchair, a nurse kneeling to check his vitals as another called for a doctor. Diane stepped back, letting them work, her daughters huddled against her sides. She could feel their small hands gripping her coat as they watched the flurry of movement. "Head laceration, possible concussion," a young nurse reported. "Get Dr. Peterson." It was like watching a switch flip in the room. Suddenly, the attention sharpened, the pace quickened. Dr. Peterson, a man whose white hair and crisp voice carried authority, arrived with a focused urgency she had never seen for anyone she knew. "Mr. Davidson," he said, his tone carrying both recognition and concern. "Let's get you into exam 3 immediately." Richard waved him off impatiently. "Just stitches and painkillers. I have a meeting tomorrow." "You have a head injury," Dr. Peterson countered. "You're staying overnight for observation." Diane's daughters exchanged curious glances. The way everyone treated him, it wasn't normal. He wasn't just a patient. He was someone. Richard's eyes flicked toward Diane. She was still there, silent in the corner, her coat zipped to her chin, the girls pressed close. She had every reason to leave now, but she didn't. That fact seemed to irritate him as much as it puzzled him. "You're still here?" he asked, as if her lingering presence was an inconvenience. "I wanted to make sure you were okay," she replied simply. He studied her for a long moment. Then, as if suddenly remembering that money solved all problems, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and held out a $20 bill. "For gas," he said, like it was a favor. Diane looked at the bill, then at him. "No, sir. Anyone would have done the same thing." "Don't be proud," he said, forcing the bill toward her. "I know people like you need every penny." Her stillness in that moment was like a wall, Keisha's small hand tightened on her sleeve, sensing the insult, but Diane only placed a calming hand over her daughter's. "People like me?" she repeated softly. Richard faltered, but his privilege spoke before humility could. "Hardworking, simple people. There's no shame in that." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I work 3 jobs to support my daughters," she said evenly. "I've cleaned the offices at Davidson Industries every night for 2 years. The southeast corner on the 15th floor is your office. You work late on Tuesdays and Thursdays. You leave 3 half-finished cups of coffee on your desk, and you sign contracts with a red pen." The words hit him harder than the accident. For the first time all night, his composure cracked. Diane glanced toward her daughters. "We should go. It's a school night." As they turned to leave, Richard called after her. "Diane." She stopped just long enough for him to see something in her eyes he couldn't name. Sharp, calculated, unshaken. Then she walked out, the ichas, of her footsteps following her into the cold night, leaving Richard Davidson staring after her, without knowing that the woman he had just underestimated would one day dismantle his world piece by piece. 2 weeks later, the smell of disinfectant and copier toner greeted Diane the way it always did when she stepped into the lobby of Davidson Industries. The polished floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, reflecting her steady stride as she wheeled her cleaning cart across the marble. On the surface, it was just another night shift, but something inside her was different now, subtle, but undeniable. The memory of that night at the hospital lingered in her mind, not because of the accident, but because of his eyes. Richard Davidson had looked at her like she was both invisible and in the way, and she had let him believe it. That invisibility was a shield now, one she could use without him ever suspecting. The building was mostly quiet, except for the faint hum of electronics and the occasional echo of distant footsteps. Most of the executives had gone home hours ago, but Diane already knew what she would find when she reached the 15th floor. Sure enough, the glass doors to Richard's office were still open, light spilling into the hallway. He was there, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, leaning over his laptop. Papers were spread across his desk in neat, deliberate piles. He didn't look up as she entered. "Diane, right?" he said, his voice distracted, as though pulling her name from somewhere far in the back of his mind. "Yes, Mr. Davidson," she replied, her tone as even as it had been at the hospital. "I forgot to thank you properly for what you did," he continued, still not meeting her eyes. He opened a drawer, pulled out an envelope, and set it on the desk without ceremony. "Here, $500. She paused mid-step, her eyes on the envelope. "That's very kind of you, but as I said before, it's not necessary." Richard's brow furrowed, his hand lingering on the envelope as if he could will her to take it. "Don't be silly. It's a generous offer." "Shao," he tilted her head slightly. "Generous," she repeated, as though testing the taste of the word. Interesting choice of term. His eyes flicked up at her for the first time that night. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," she said simply, resuming her work. "Just observing that generosity means different things to different people." The faintest crease formed between his brows, but he said nothing. He returned to his screen, typing with sharp, deliberate keystrokes. Diane emptied the wastebasket beside his desk, her gaze moving casually but intentionally over the folders spread open before him. She registered dates, company names, and contract headers without breaking rhythm. As she moved toward the door, she heard him mutter something under his breath about a meeting with the CFO. She tucked that detail away with the rest. Walking back to her cart, she felt it again. That quiet shift of power. He still saw her as invisible, but now she understood the gift in that. It meant she could stand in the middle of his empire, listen to the conversations he thought no one heard, and watch the moves he thought no one saw, all without ever raising suspicion. And Richard Davidson had no idea that the woman emptying his trash had already begun to see the cracks in his empire, and was waiting for the perfect moment to pull them wide open. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Diane stepped inside, her cart rattling over the threshold. It was nearly 11 o'clock at night, the hour when the building felt like it belonged to ghosts, and the hum of the air conditioning was the loudest sound in the world. Just as the doors began to close, a voice called out, "Hold the elevator!" She pressed the button and watched as a man in a slightly wrinkled gray suit jogged toward her. He wasn't one of the sleek, sharp-edged executives she was used to seeing here. His tie was loosened, his hair a little mussed, and his briefcase looked like it had seen 100 courtrooms. "Thanks," he said, stepping in beside her and offering a friendly nod. "Late night?" "Always," she replied with a small smile. "You?" "Marcus Torres," he said, extending a hand. "Labor attorney. My office is on the ground floor." Diane shook his hand, noting the warmth in his grip. Real warmth, not the performative politeness she got from most people here. "I've seen you around," Marcus continued. "You're always working late, but you're quiet. Professional. I bet you see and hear a lot in this building." His tone wasn't prying, it was observational, almost respectful. Still, Diane felt her guard rise. "Sometimes," she said, keeping her answer neutral. He leaned casually against the wall. "I work with people who've been pushed around by the system, discrimination, unfair layoffs, hostile work environments. You'd be surprised how often cleaning staff have the clearest picture of what's really going on in a company." Diane met his gaze. There was no arrogance there, no hint that he saw her as less. Just curiosity, and maybe a touch of understanding. "I'm not surprised," she said quietly. "Some people forget that invisible doesn't mean blind." Marcus's mouth curved into a slow smile. "Well said." The elevator dinged and the doors opened onto the lobby. He stepped out but paused, looking back. "If you ever feel like talking, my door's open, no pressure." Diane nodded but said nothing, watching as he disappeared down the hall. As the doors closed again, she found herself thinking about his words. It was true. She had spent the last 2 years moving silently through these offices, her presence barely acknowledged. She'd overheard tense negotiations, celebratory toasts, and careless remarks that revealed far more than the speaker intended. She'd learned that invisibility could be a curse, but it could also be a weapon. And for the first time, she wondered what might happen if she stopped just storing those observations in her head and started doing something with them. When the elevator stopped at the 15th floor, Diane stepped out into the dimly lit corridor, the carpet muffling her footsteps. Somewhere down the hall, Richard Davidson was still in his office talking to someone on speakerphone, his voice carrying the same confidence she'd heard the night of the accident. She moved toward the sound, pushing her cart, her expression as calm and unreadable as ever. But inside, something was shifting, a sense that this building was no longer just a place she worked. It was a place where she was learning the layout of the battlefield, and Marcus Torres might just be the first ally she didn't even know she needed. The hum of the vacuum cleaner masked the low murmur of voices spilling from the partially open conference room door. Diane was working her way down the 15th floor hallway, her eyes on the patterned carpet, her ears tuned to the tone of the conversation more than the words themselves. It was late enough that most of the building's lights had been dimmed, leaving pools of illumination under doorways and in the corners where floor lamps still burned. Richard's voice was unmistakable. It carried that same effortless authority, the kind that had people leaning in whether they wanted to or not. She slowed her pace just enough to catch the words. Outsourced cleaning staff, easily replaceable, unskilled labor, no value added. We can cut them and bring in an automated service, saves us $300,000 a year. The words hit her like a slap. Diane's hand tightened on the vacuum handle. She stepped a little closer, peering in through the narrow gap in the door. Richard sat at the head of the long table, leaning back in his chair, speaking to someone over a video call on the large screen. His tone was casual, almost bored, like he was discussing the removal of an outdated piece of office furniture instead of the livelihoods of real people. "They're easily replaceable," he repeated, gesturing to a chart on the table. "No skill, no added value. We'll reallocate the savings to Q4 projections." Diane's jaw clenched. She knew the people he was talking about. She knew the way their knees ached after 12 hours on their feet, the way they'd show up sick because missing a shift meant not making rent. They weren't nameless staff to her. They were friends, women who brought her homemade cornbread for lunch, who traded shifts so she could take her daughters to the doctor, who knew exactly how much pain a back could take before it gave out. And just like that, there were no value added. She kept her movement steady, her face impassive, as she turned off the vacuum and switched to dusting the credenza just outside the room. It was the perfect cover, No one noticed a cleaning lady dusting. No one thought she was listening. The call ended. Richard gathered his papers, humming quietly to himself as if nothing of consequence had just been decided. He didn't even glance toward the door as he left, striding past her without acknowledgement. Diane stood there for a moment, her feather duster motionless in her hand. The hallway was silent now, but inside her head, his words echoed like a drumbeat. Unskilled. Replaceable. No value added. She thought about the BMW crumpled on the side of the road, about the $20 he had offered her, about the envelope of money she'd refused, and about the way he had looked at her like she was a small, irrelevant detail in a much bigger picture. Something settled in her chest then. Not rage exactly, but a cold, deliberate resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who'd been reduced to a number on a balance sheet by men like Richard Davidson. She picked up the vacuum handle again, the hum returning as she pushed it down the hallway. Her face was calm, almost serene. But behind that calm was a plan beginning to take shape, one that Richard would never see coming. And tonight, without knowing it, he had just given her the perfect reason to start. The office was quiet again the following night, but for Diane, the silence felt different now. It wasn't the usual stillness of an empty building. Tonight, it felt charged, like the pause between a match being struck and the moment the flame catches. She moved through the 15th floor with her cart, methodically emptying bins and wiping surfaces, but her attention wasn't on the dust and trash. It was on the large mahogany desk at the far end of Richard Davidson's office. His desk. The same desk where he left his work spread out with the careless confidence of a man who believed no one of consequence would ever touch it. The blinds were half closed, shadows slanting across the room. Richard was gone for the night. That was the first thing she'd confirmed when she stepped off the elevator. The second thing she confirmed, before she'd even started cleaning, was that a stack of papers sat on his desk, half shielded by an open leather folio. Diane approached slowly, the wheels of her cart squeaking faintly over the carpet. Her pulse was steady, but her breath felt heavier in her chest. She had no business looking through a CEO's private documents, none at all. But something about last night's conversation still echoed in her ears. Unskilled. Replaceable. Her eyes fell on the bold type across the top of the first page. Acquisition strategy. Hartwell Construction. She froze. Hartwell Construction. The name alone was enough to make her throat tighten. It was where James, her husband, had worked for almost a decade before the company folded. His layoff had been brutal, sudden. They'd called it market shifts at the time. Diane had believed it was just bad luck. Now she began to read. Her gaze scanned the lines, the neat corporate language that masked something rotten. The strategy was coldly meticulous. Identify Hartwell's most critical contracts, quietly undermine them. Through competitive underbidding, use insider connections to delay their payments, and then, when the company was desperate, offer to purchase it for an attractive but realistic sum. Her stomach turned. This wasn't bad luck. It was a deliberate dismantling, and Richard Davidson's name was printed right there, approving every step. She pulled out her phone and, with hands that were steadier than she expected, began taking photos, page after page, document after document. She worked fast, the soft click of the camera nearly lost in the low hum of the building. When she was done, she slipped the papers back exactly as she'd found them, making sure every angle and fold matched. To anyone else, the desk would look untouched. As she moved toward the door, her eyes caught on the framed photo on the credenza, Richard shaking hands with another man in front of a construction site. The small brass plate beneath read, Hartwell Acquisition, 2023. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring at it. Then she turned, wheeled her cart into the hallway, and resumed her cleaning. Her face was calm, her movements unhurried, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer just a matter of overheard insults or wounded pride. Now it was personal. Richard Davidson hadn't just devalued her and her colleagues. He'd destroyed her husband's livelihood, chipped away at their life together, and helped set in motion the chain of events that had ended with James in the ground. And that meant the clock had just started ticking for him. From that night on, Diane's work in the building changed. Outwardly, she was the same quiet, efficient cleaning lady she had always been. her cart rolling down the corridors, her uniform neat, her smile polite when anyone happened to notice her. But behind that practiced calm, every step was part of a plan. She began arriving earlier, always with a reason ready if the night supervisor asked. The truth was, she wanted the overlap, the precious hour when a few executives lingered and meetings ran late, when office doors were half open and conversations spilled into the hall. She moved slowly during those times, her mop or feather duster in hand, her posture suggesting she was entirely absorbed in her work. But her ears were sharp, her eyes sharper. Every unattended desk was a potential opportunity. If a folder was left open, she memorized headers and dates before closing it neatly. If a phone call was left on speaker, she drifted closer under the guise of emptying a trash can. Her phone, tucked discreetly in the apron pocket of her uniform, became her most valuable tool. She kept the sound off, learned the angle at which she could lift it, and snap a photo without catching the glare from overhead lights. She developed a rhythm: photo, replace, step back, wipe the surface. Over the next few weeks, the collection grew. Emails printed and abandoned in the copy room, notes scribbled in the margins of meeting agendas, charts forecasting cost-saving layoffs. She photographed contracts with suspicious clauses and even caught snippets of Richard's late-night video calls, conversations with board members about strategic market manipulation that sounded dangerously close to fraud. But she didn't just gather documents, she listened. One evening, while cleaning outside the executive lounge, she overheard Richard laughing with two other men over glasses of scotch. "You have, to make them think they're sinking on their own," Richard said, the amber drink glinting in his hand. "Step in with a lifeline and they'll sign anything." The men chuckled, their voices warm with alcohol and self-satisfaction. Diane's grip tightened around the handle of her mop. She let their words sink in, committing each one to memory. Later, she sat at her kitchen table after the girls had gone to bed, her laptop open and her notes spread in careful rows. The evidence was no longer random, it was forming a shape. She began organizing everything by date, topic, and company involved. Hartwell Construction had its own thick folder, digital and physical, filled with proof of the sabotage she now knew had been deliberate. It was a strange kind of power she felt, sitting there in the quiet with the hum of the refrigerator in the background. For 2 years, she had been invisible in Richard Davidson's world, a shadow moving through his empire with a broom and a trash bag. Now, she was something else entirely, someone who knew his habits, his vulnerabilities, his mistakes. And she wasn't going to waste a single detail. What Richard didn't know was that every condescending look, every careless word, every arrogant decision he'd made in her presence had been silently recorded in her mind, and now in her files. She had no set deadline, no rush. This was not a job for speed. This was a job for precision. Because when the moment came, she intended to make sure Richard Davidson never saw it coming until it was far, far too late. The elevator doors slid open on the ground floor, and Diane wheeled her cart inside. The lobby was nearly empty at this hour, the marble floors echoing under her shoes. She pressed the button for the first floor, already thinking about the files she'd tucked neatly back into Richard's desk upstairs. Just before the doors closed, a hand slipped between them. Marcus Torres stepped inside, his gray suit a little more rumpled than usual, his tie loosened as though the day had wrung every last drop of energy from him. "Burning the midnight oil again?" he asked with a tired smile. "Looks like you are too," she replied. He leaned against the wall, watching her for a beat. "You know, I meant what I said last time. Cleaning staff see and hear more than anyone realizes." She studied him for a moment, then asked, "And if someone saw or heard things that weren't right? Things that were illegal?" His posture straightened. "Depends what we're talking about. Illegal is a big word." The elevator hummed quietly between floors. She could hear her own heart beating. This was the moment to test him, just a little. "I'm talking about practices that could ruin lives, companies being dismantled on purpose, discrimination, fraud." Marcus's eyes sharpened. "That's not just big, that's federal." He leaned closer, his voice low. "Do you have something?" Diane didn't answer right away. The elevator doors opened, and instead of stepping out, she nodded toward his office down the hall. "Let's talk." In his office, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Stacks of case files were piled on the desk, some open, some spilling onto the floor. Diane set her cleaning cart to the side and reached into her bag. She pulled out a plain envelope, thicker than it should have been, and placed it in front of him. Marcus opened it carefully. Inside were printouts of emails, photographs of Contrim, acts, and notes in Diane's neat handwriting. His brow furrowed deeper with each page. "This?" He set down the papers and met her eyes. "Do you realize what you have here?" "I realize exactly what I have," she said evenly. "This is enough for multiple lawsuits, discrimination, corporate fraud, market manipulation. If it holds up, it could bury Davidson Industries." Her voice was steady, but there was a flicker of something darker underneath. "Good. I'm not just trying to stop him, Marcus. I want him to understand exactly what he's done." "Why?" She hesitated, her gaze drifting to the far wall. "Because this isn't just numbers on a page. Hartwell Construction. My husband worked there. James. He died not long after the company collapsed. And now I know that collapse wasn't an accident." The silence in the room was heavy. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Diane, this is dangerous. You'd have to be prepared for a fight, one that could get ugly." Her eyes locked on his. "I've been fighting to survive since James died. Ugly doesn't scare me anymore." Marcus tapped the envelope. "Then we start building this case, carefully, quietly. The cleaner the evidence, the less chance it can be thrown out. You keep doing exactly what you're doing. I'll handle the rest." Diane nodded once, then picked up her cart. As she stepped into the hallway, she felt something new settle inside her, not just determination, but momentum. Richard Davidson still had no idea his empire had a crack in its foundation, and now she wasn't the only one holding the chisel. The following nights unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Diane moved through Davidson Industries with the same quiet precision she always had, mop in hand, trash bag rustling softly, the faint scent of lemon cleaner trailing in her wake. To anyone watching, she was exactly what she'd always been, part of the background. But beneath the surface, every step, every pause, every glance was calculated. Marcus had been clear. This was about patience and precision. The more meticulous the evidence, the less room Richard's lawyers would have to twist the truth. So Diane honed her routine into a weapon. She started with timing. She knew Richard's schedule by heart. When he stepped out for late-night calls, when he left documents open on his desk while grabbing coffee, even the way he paced when he was on the phone. Those moments became her openings. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, when he stayed later than most, she'd work nearby, moving slowly enough to catch snippets of conversation. His voice carried, even when he thought it didn't. One night, she heard him telling a board member, "They'll fold before the quarter's over. We'll scoop them up for pennies." Her phone recorded every word from inside her apron pocket. Other nights, she focused on the offices of his top executives. She learned which assistants were careless with their printing cues, leaving confidential reports in the tray. She memorized passcodes punched into conference room screens, storing them away in the mental vault she'd been building for 2 years. She never lingered long in one place. A good hunter doesn't spook the prey. At home, once the girls were asleep, she'd spread the day's findings across the kitchen table. Marcus had given her a small scanner and an encrypted drive, tools that made her feel, for the first time in years, like she was working in the field she'd once trained for. The MBA she'd left unfinished after James's death was suddenly alive in her again, each strategy meeting and business lecture resurfacing in her mind as she connected the dots between Richard's words and the documents in front of her. The picture forming was bigger than she'd imagined. It wasn't just Hartwell Construction. There were at least 4 other small companies, each one gutted in the same methodical way. Contracts sabotaged, payments withheld, rumors quietly seeded to poison relationships with clients. And each time, Richard's name appeared in the chain of approvals. By the 3rd week, the quiet satisfaction of her progress was tempered by a sharp awareness. If Richard ever suspected her, everything could unravel in an instant. That thought might have scared her once. Now, it only sharpened her focus. Marcus was working the legal angles, discreetly passing copies of her evidence to federal investigators he trusted. Every time they spoke, his voice carried more weight, more certainty. "It's coming together," he told her one night over the phone. "Just keep doing what you're doing." So she did. And in those long, silent hours between midnight and dawn, Diane began to feel something she hadn't felt since James was alive. Not just the satisfaction of work well done, but the anticipation of a reckoning. Richard Davidson thought he was playing chess while everyone else played checkers. He didn't know that someone had been studying his game all along, and she was just a few moves away from flipping the entire board. The trap had been set so quietly, so precisely, that even Diane herself was surprised by how natural it felt to keep moving as if nothing were happening. Every night she kept to her routine, dusting, emptying bins, wiping down glass, while the case against Richard Davidson swelled in the shadows. Marcus assured her the evidence was no longer just a collection of documents. It was a blueprint of a corporate crime syndicate hiding in plain sight. But Richard, he had no clue. In fact, in those final days before everything broke, he seemed more self-assured than ever. He walked the 15th floor like a king surveying his kingdom, barking orders into his phone, laughing in meetings, talking loudly about a major announcement coming at the next board gathering. Diane played her part perfectly. She was the silent witness, the invisible worker who slipped in and out of his office without so much as a glance. But behind her calm expression, she was tightening every thread in the web. She kept her cleaning carts stocked with the same careful arrangement, trash bags on top, cleaner bottles in the middle, and, hidden beneath, the small digital recorder Marcus had given her. It was voice-activated, designed to capture even whispers. She left it tucked under the lip of a bookshelf during late-night meetings, retrieving it hours later when no one was around. On a Tuesday night, less than a week before the storm, she caught a goldmine. Richard, his CFO, and 2 board members strategizing about the next acquisition. Their tone was smug, like men discussing a game they'd already won. The phrases they used, force compliance, bleed them dry, tie them up in court until they break, were exactly the kind of language Marcus had told her to pray for. When she listened to the playback later at her kitchen table, Diane felt a dark satisfaction she couldn't quite put into words. Every sentence was another nail in his coffin. Marcus called the next morning. "It's time." The FBI had the bulk of the evidence now, enough to justify a federal subpoena. The plan was to move fast, in public, with the media tipped off so there would be no quiet settlement, no chance for Richard to bury the story. Marcus wanted the takedown to be visible. To Richard, to the board, to everyone who had ever been crushed under the heel of Davidson Industries. Diane said nothing for a long moment, her hand resting on the kitchen counter. "When?" "Monday morning, right before his big board meeting. He'll be expecting applause, he'll get handcuffs." She almost smiled, not because she enjoyed the idea of seeing a man destroyed, but because of the balance in it. This wasn't spite, it was symmetry. The same arrogance that had made Richard so careless was now the reason he wouldn't see the end coming. Over the next few days, Diane kept her head down. She didn't speak to Marcus in the building, didn't change her pace or her patterns. To anyone watching, she was just the same woman who emptied trash cans and wiped down desks. But inside, she was counting down the hours. Monday was coming, and with it, the moment Richard Davidson would finally understand that invisible people weren't just watching, they were keeping score. Monday morning dawned crisp and bright, the kind of day that made the city look almost polished. From her small kitchen window, Diane watched the sunlight spill over the rooftops as she poured coffee into a travel mug. She wasn't in her uniform yet, she didn't need to be. Today wasn't about cleaning offices. Today was about clearing something far bigger. By 6:30 a.m., she was in the lobby of Davidson Industries, moving with the steady pace of someone who belonged there. The security guard nodded her through without a second glance. Her cart rolled over the marble floor, wheels squeaking in the stillness. Upstairs on the 15th floor, Richard was already in his office. Through the glass wall, she saw him leaning over a spread of papers, phone wedged between his ear and shoulder. His voice was brisk, confident. He was preparing for the board meeting like a man expecting to walk in and hear applause. Diane moved down the hall, stopping in the break room to wipe down counters that didn't need wiping. She was buying time, waiting for the moment Marcus had told her about. At 8:30 sharp, footsteps thundered in the hallway. Richard's assistant burst in, his face pale. "Sir, there are reporters in the lobby. Dozens. And—" he hesitated. "The FBI is here." Richard's head snapped up. "The what?" Before the assistant could answer, 3 figures in dark suits appeared in the doorway, 2 federal agents and Marcus Torres. The room seemed to shrink. "Richard Davidson," the lead agent said, voice clear and firm. "You are being subpoenaed to appear before a federal grand jury. Preliminary charges include corporate fraud, market manipulation, systematic workplace discrimination, and tax evasion." Richard blinked, confusion flashing into anger. "This is ridiculous. I have a meeting." "You have a date with the federal building," Marcus cut in, stepping forward, "and I believe why. You know our lead witness." Richard's gaze slid past him, landing on Diane. She stood in the corner of his office, no cart, no cleaning supplies, just her, tall, steady, and watching him with a calm that made his skin prickle. "Diane?" His voice cracked on her name, the first time he'd ever said it like he knew it. Marcus opened a folder and spread its contents across Richard's desk. Photographs of contracts, printouts of emails, transcripts of recorded conversations. "Over the past 6 months, Ms. Williams has meticulously documented your illegal practices. Every meeting, every document, every word you thought no one heard, she heard. And now the federal government has it all." Richard's face drained of color. "You were spying on me." "I was doing my job," Diane said evenly. "Cleaning up, not just your office, the mess you've been making everywhere." The agents stepped closer. Down in the street, sirens wailed faintly, growing louder. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Diane could see the swarm of reporters in the parking lot, their cameras pointed toward the building. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a public unmasking. Richard glanced toward the door as if searching for an escape route, but there wasn't one. He looked back at Diane, his voice low and desperate. "Why?" She held his gaze, her answer steady as stone. "Because James Williams wasn't just a name on a termination form. He was my husband. And you destroyed more than his job. You destroyed our life. This is for him. And for everyone you thought was replaceable." The lead agent produced the cuffs. "Mr. Davidson, you'll need to come with us." As they led him out, Richard passed Diane one last time. She didn't flinch, didn't move. The door closed behind him, the sound final and sharp. For the first time in years, she felt the air in this office shift, lighter, cleaner, as though the walls themselves, understood that the man who had poisoned them was gone. And it wasn't the kind of clean that came from lemon-scented polish. This was the kind of clean that lasted. The moment Richard stepped out of the elevator with 2 FBI agents gripping his elbows, the 15th floor hallway became a stage, and he was the unwilling star. Cameras from the press, somehow already inside the building, flashed like lightning, each burst catching the sharp angles of his pale, stunned face. Down in the lobby, the crowd was thicker. News reporters lined the security desk, microphones extended, shouting his name over the hum of live broadcasts. The marble floor echoed with the click of polished shoes, the scrape of camera tripods, the low buzz of voices turning into a tidal wave of questions. "Mr. Davidson, are you being charged with corporate fraud? Can you confirm the allegations of workplace discrimination? Did you sabotage Hartwell Construction?" Each question landed like a slap, but Richard's jaw was locked tight. He looked like a man who had been ambushed in his own home, which in a way, he had. Through the glass wall of the boardroom upstairs, Diane watched the chaos unfold. She didn't linger in the doorway. She stood at the head of the long table, the same seat Richard had always claimed during meetings. The irony was not lost on her. The board members had gathered earlier than usual, expecting to discuss quarterly numbers. Instead, they were witnessing their CEO being escorted out of the building in handcuffs. The faces around the table were a collage of shock, disbelief, and on a few, barely concealed satisfaction. Richard's assistant stumbled in, his voice shaking. "The press is all over this. Channel 7 has a live feed. The shareholders are already calling in." And He swallowed hard. Your wife is on the phone. She says she's watching this on television. For a man who had once spoken with effortless authority, Richard now looked small, smaller than Diane had ever seen him. His gaze flicked upward, meeting hers through the glass, all across the lobby. There was no smugness, no calculation left in his eyes, only disbelief. The agents paused briefly at the exit while the crowd surged forward, reporters pressing in to catch his expression. Richard turned one last time toward the 15th floor, toward Diane. His lips moved, just a single word she couldn't hear, but she knew what it was. How? She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply held his gaze and let him feel the weight of the truth, that every step of his downfall had been built in silence, right under his nose by someone he'd dismissed as irrelevant. As the glass doors closed behind him and the crowd spilled out into the parking lot, Diane turned away from the window. The boardroom was silent now, the only sound the faint murmur of the news feed still playing from someone's phone. She picked up her cleaning gloves from the table, not because she needed to work, but because they were hers. A reminder of where she had come from and how far she was about to go. The building felt different now. The air wasn't heavy anymore. The man who had ruled it with arrogance was gone, and in his place was a vacuum. Diane intended to fill it. The FBI sedan idled at the curb, its back door open, waiting to swallow Richard Davidson whole. The agents had already guided him through the gauntlet of flashing cameras and shouted accusations, their hands firm on his arms. But before they could usher him inside, Marcus Torres stepped forward, one hand raised. Just a moment, Marcus told the lead agent. Our lead witness has something to say. Richard's brow furrowed in confusion, his eyes darting from Marcus to the crowd. Then he saw her. Diane stepped out from the lobby, moving through the crush of reporters with unhurried steps. She wasn't in her cleaning uniform today, no gloves, no apron, just a dark blazer, tailored enough to fit the way she carried herself now. She stopped 2 feet from him, the noise of the street dulling in her ears until all she heard was her own heartbeat. Diane? His voice was hoarse, brittle, as if her name had to force its way past the disbelief in his throat. You asked me why, she said, her tone even, almost quiet. But the stillness in her voice drew more attention than a shout ever could. Why I did this. Why I spent months gathering every word, every document, every deal you thought was untouchable. She took one measured step closer. James Williams, that's why. Richard blinked as if trying to place the name. You don't remember, she cut in, not accusing, just stating the truth. He worked for Hartwell Construction for 10 years. You destroyed that company, deliberately, sabotaged contracts, pushed them into the ground and bought them for scraps. He came home one night with a cardboard box of his things, no severance, no health insurance. 3 months later, a beam fell on him at a job he took just to keep us fed. He didn't survive. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came. The roar of the cameras was a distant echo. You didn't just take a job from him, Dia, and continued. You took his future. Our future. And when I stopped to help you on that road, bleeding in your $1,000 shoes, you tried to hand me a $20 bill, as if my humanity had a price. Her eyes were steady on his, no anger now, just something sharper. You never saw me, not really, but I saw you. Every Tuesday and Thursday night for 2 years, I watched you make decisions that destroyed lives. I listened when you thought no one was listening. I read what you left lying around because you assumed no one like me could understand it. You were wrong. The silence between them was deafening. Even the reporters seemed to hold their breath. You tried to buy me for $20, she said finally. You lost $300 million instead. That's what I call a bad deal, even for someone with your management skills. Richard's face collapsed into something between shame and disbelief, but before he could speak, the agent's hand pressed lightly on his shoulder. Time to go, sir. He was guided into the back seat, the door closing with a heavy thud. Diane stood there a moment longer, the wind tugging at her blazer. Then she turned and walked back into the building, her steps steady, her head high. For the first time in years, she wasn't the invisible cleaning lady. She was the woman who had taken down Richard Davidson, and she hadn't needed to raise her voice to do it. By the afternoon, the news cycle had transformed Richard Davidson's arrest from a shocking headline into a full-blown public spectacle. Every network ran looping footage of him being led into the federal building, flanked by agents, his jaw tight and eyes dark. The media didn't just cover the arrest, they dissected it, dragging out every old lawsuit, every rumor of hostile takeovers, every anonymous employee complaint that had been buried over the years. Inside Davidson Industries, the ripple effect was immediate and merciless. The board convened an emergency session without Richard for the first time in nearly 2 decades. A few tried to defend him, insisting this was all a misunderstanding, but the stack of evidence Marcus had delivered to federal prosecutors and then quietly shared with key board members made defense impossible. Contracts were frozen. Stock value plummeted in real time. Vendors called to clarify their positions, already preparing to sever ties. And when the markets closed, the ticker showed a staggering loss, one that would bleed into the millions by morning. Diane didn't sit at the table during the board meeting. She didn't need to. She stood just outside the frosted glass doors, her presence known but not intrusive. People who had never looked her in the eye before now nodded as they passed, some offering quiet, good job murmurs they might have been afraid to say earlier. Marcus moved between rooms like a man who had rehearsed this day for years. He met with compliance officers, took calls from federal attorneys, and fielded a constant stream of press inquiries. But every so often, his gaze would meet Diane's through the doorway, and a subtle nod would pass between them, a silent recognition of how far they'd come since that night on the highway. Richard's personal life began to unravel in tandem with his empire. By mid-afternoon, word sent down that his wife had filed for separation. A leaked photo showed moving trucks parked outside their estate, men in uniforms carrying out boxes. Social media feasted on the details, users posting side-by-side images of the mansion being emptied and the footage of Richard in handcuffs. The FBI wasted no time. Search warrants were executed at his home and private office. Computers, hard drives, and locked cabinets were hauled away under tight security. The press swarmed the property gates, their lenses capturing every movement, every whisper. And through it all, Diane stayed in the building. She didn't gloat. She didn't bask in the chaos. She was steady, present in the moment, but already looking ahead, because she knew this wasn't just an ending. It was the hinge between the life she'd been forced to live and the one she was about to claim. By evening, the board had voted to remove Richard as CEO and appoint an interim leadership team. And though her name wasn't mentioned in the official press release, everyone in that building knew the truth. The cleaning woman who had once been invisible had brought the empire's giant to his knees. As the sun dipped below the city skyline, casting a golden reflection against the glass tower, Diane walked out of the building. The air felt different now, lighter, unburdened. The night ahead was hers, but so was the future. The final reckoning wasn't over yet. The trial would come, and with it, the whole truth laid bare for the world to see. But in this moment, she allowed herself the quiet, private satisfaction of knowing she had done something most people only dreamed of. She had faced the man who took everything from her, and she had won. The courthouse was packed. Journalists filled the front steps, their cameras pointed toward the great stone entrance as if it were the mouth of a legend. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of coffee, paper, and quiet tension. Every seat in the gallery was taken. People leaned forward, waiting for the story that had dominated headlines for months to finally reach its conclusion. Richard Davidson sat at the defense table in a dark suit that fit looser than it once had, the shine in his hair dulled, the edge in his eyes gone. He no longer looked like the man who had commanded boardrooms with a smirk. He looked smaller, like the years of invincibility had been stripped away layer by layer until nothing was left but the core of what he really was. Diane sat behind the prosecution's table, not because she had to, but because she wanted to see this through to the very last moment. Her daughters were in the second row, dressed neatly, their hands folded in their laps. They had lived through the lean years, the double shifts, the late nights she'd returned home too tired to speak. This wasn't just her victory, it was theirs too. The prosecutors laid out their case with precision. Emails, financial records, witness testimony, all of it painted the same damning picture, a man who had built his empire on the deliberate ruin of others. They spoke of market manipulation, of illegal kickbacks, of contracts shredded in the shadows so that Richard could swoop in and claim the remains. And then came her turn. Diane stepped up to the witness stand, her right hand raised for the oath. The microphone caught every word, but her voice didn't shake. She told them about James, how he'd been loyal to his company, how he'd come home the night Davidson Industries swallowed Hartwell Construction, carrying a box of his life in his arms. She told them about the job that broke his body and the bills that drowned them. And she told them about the night she found Richard on that empty Alabama road, bleeding under the glow of the headlights, and how he'd tried to hand her a $20 bill as if her kindness could be bought. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The truth had a way of cutting deeper than anything else. When the verdict came, the room seemed to hold its breath. Guilty, on all counts. The judge's gavel came down like the final beat of a drum, and just like that, Richard's future was sealed. Years in federal prison, assets seized, a reputation permanently blackened. Outside, the crowd surged, hungry for quotes, for photographs, for anything to wrap up the story. But Diane didn't stop for interviews. She walked down the courthouse steps with her daughters at her side, the cool air filling her lungs. Marcus caught up with her at the curb. "It's over," he said, but she shook her head. "No," she said softly, "it's just beginning." The settlement she'd been awarded in the civil suit was enough to change everything, not just for her family, but for others like hers. She'd already decided what to do with it, a foundation in James's name, one that would help families crushed by corporate greed rebuild their lives. She wanted something that would outlive her, something that couldn't be erased. That night at home, she stood in her small kitchen, now warm with the smell of dinner and the sound of her daughters laughing in the next room. She placed James's old work gloves on the counter. For years, they'd been a reminder of what she'd lost. Now they felt like a promise of what she could build. The woman who had once been invisible was invisible no longer. She was a name people knew, a voice people listened to, and a force they would never see coming until it was too late. And somewhere in a cold, gray prison cell, Richard Davidson finally understood what she had told him the day he was arrested, that the worst mistake a man like him could make was underestimating someone like her. Because Diane Williams had been cleaning up messes her whole life, she just finally started with his.